The angel number. You see right before your life splits into before and after. You already know the day, not because anything dramatic happened on it, because afterward, you started counting time differently, before that day, and after it. Maybe it was a phone call. Maybe it was one sentence someone said to you in passing. Maybe it was just a Tuesday that felt strangely heavier than it should have. You could not explain why. You just knew something had shifted even though nothing around you had technically changed yet. Here is the first answer, stated plainly. That feeling is real, and it has a marker. A specific number appears right before these dividing moments, not after, before. It shows up while you are still standing inside the old version of your life, as if something already knows the split is coming before you do. That is the surface. The deeper layer is why this number chooses that exact moment, and what it is actually preparing you for. We will name it, and we will go all the way into what it means. The day the line gets drawn. There is a version of you that existed before this number entered your life. Try to picture her or him for a second. That person did not know what was coming. They had routines, plans that felt permanent, a way of explaining their life that made sense at the time. Then something started to feel slightly off, in a way that was hard to name. Not painful exactly, just misaligned, like a picture frame hanging a few degrees from straight. People around you kept saying everything looked fine, and on paper it probably was. But you stopped trusting paper. This is the part most people misunderstand completely. They think the dividing line appears the moment something visibly breaks. A diagnosis, a goodbye, a door closing loudly behind someone. But the line is drawn earlier than that, quietly, while life still looks identical from the outside. The real split happens internally first. The external version catches up later. You were noticing repeated numbers around this time. On clocks, on receipts, on license plates you were not even trying to read. Most people dismiss this as coincidence because coincidence is comfortable. It asks nothing of you. It does not require you to look directly at the shift already happening underneath your life. But you kept seeing it. And some quiet part of you started paying attention, even while the rational part of you tried to explain it away. Here is what almost nobody tells you about this stage. The number does not appear to confirm that change is coming. It appears because the change has already started, and your conscious mind is the last one to find out. Your nervous system knew first. Your sleep changed first. Your patience for certain conversations thinned out first, before you had any language for why. The number is not a warning sent ahead of time. It is closer to a marker dropped at the exact spot where one chapter quietly ends and another begins, even if you will not understand the ending for a while. This is why so many people misread the entire experience. They wait for proof. They wait for something undeniable before they admit anything has shifted. The proof comes eventually, but by then the line was already behind you. What you are about to learn next is the identity of this number and the precise window in which it tends to appear. Once you see the pattern clearly, you will recognize it everywhere you have already lived it. But first you need to understand why your mind resisted this signal for so long, and what that resistance was actually protecting you from. Why your body knew before your mind did. Long before you consciously decided anything was changing, your body had already started behaving differently. You may have noticed it as restlessness, or exhaustion that sleep did not fix. This is not coincidence, and it is not anxiety without a cause. It is recognition happening at a level faster than language. The body tracks pattern shifts before the mind agrees to acknowledge them. It senses incongruence, the gap between the life you are still performing and the life that is quietly forming underneath it. That gap creates tension. The tension shows up as tightness in your chest during ordinary conversations, as a strange pull to be alone when you used to crave company. People in this stage often describe feeling like an actor in their own life, going through the motions correctly while sensing, somewhere underneath, that none of it fits anymore. This is precisely the window where the number begins appearing with more frequency, and the number is 717. 717 on a clock. The total on a receipt landing at $7.17. 17 minutes past 7, twice in 1 week. 717 is the number that marks a threshold between two versions of a life. That is why it surfaces now, in this exact window, and not during the settled stretches when nothing underneath you is moving. Here's the detail almost everyone misses at this stage. The number is not trying to predict your future. It is reflecting a threshold you have already physically crossed, even though your conscious story has not caught up yet. This explains why so many people feel disoriented right before major transitions. They keep asking what is wrong, when the more accurate question would be what already changed. Your body is rarely confused about this. It adjusts its rhythms, its appetite, its tolerance for noise and people, long before your mind finishes its explanation. That disorientation you have been feeling is not a malfunction. It is the natural lag between a body that already moved and a mind still finishing its sentence about the old version of your life. The number you keep encountering is 717. It tends to surface in this exact window, the space between an ending your body has already registered and a beginning your mind has not yet named. 717 does not appear to soothe you the way some signs are described as doing. It appears to mark a threshold, the precise point where one identity quietly closes and another one starts forming underneath it, before you have any proof that it is happening. This is the deeper reason it shows up now, and not earlier or later. The timing is precise. It is a structural marker, placed exactly where the old pattern ends and the new one begins to take shape. Most people will never connect the appearances of 717 to this internal threshold, because they are taught to look for external confirmation first. But your body already gave you the confirmation, weeks before the number ever caught your eye. There is a second layer underneath this one, though, and it has to do with why your mind specifically resists accepting an ending before it sees a beginning. That resistance is not weakness. It is a form of protection, and we are about to look directly at what it protects. What the numbers 7, 1, and 7 are actually saying. Numbers like this are rarely arbitrary in the way people assume. 717 is built from a specific arrangement, and that arrangement carries its own logic, separate from the feeling it produces. The 7 on either side represents a threshold being crossed, the kind of internal recognition that arrives only after something has been tested and understood at a deeper level than before. The one sitting between those two 7s represents something narrower and more personal, a single decision, a single identity, a single direction chosen, rather than several options left open indefinitely. Here is what this arrangement is actually communicating. A threshold experience, on either side, framing an individual choice in the middle. Recognition first, then a decision, then recognition again, confirming that the decision was registered correctly. This is different from numbers built around repetition alone, like seeing the same digit 4 times in a row. Those tend to function as amplification, the same message intensified through repetition. 717 works through structure instead of repetition. It is sequence, not volume. Threshold, choice, threshold again. Like a door opening, a person walking through it and the door closing behind them to confirm the crossing actually happened. This explains something many people notice without understanding why. The sightings often arrive in clusters around decisions, not around random moments scattered evenly throughout a week. You see it right before choosing to leave, right before choosing to stay somewhere different than expected, right before saying a sentence out loud that you had only allowed yourself to think privately before. The structure of the number is mirroring the structure of what you are actually living through, a real choice, bracketed by 2 moments of recognition, one before you commit and one after. Most spiritual content treats every number as a vague universal greeting, identical in function no matter what shape it takes. That flattens what is actually a fairly precise piece of architecture. 717 is not telling you something is happening to you passively. It is confirming that you are the one making this happen, through an actual decision, with the threshold on either side simply marking where that decision begins and ends. Carry that distinction forward. This is not a sign asking you to wait for something external to arrive. It is a structural confirmation that you already moved, deliberately, even on days it did not feel like movement at all. The old self does not leave quietly. There is an assumption many people carry into a transition like this. They assume the old version of themselves will fade gently, almost politely, while the new version slowly takes its place. That is rarely how it actually works. The old self tends to resist its own ending, sometimes loudly, often through habits that suddenly feel more urgent than usual. You might notice yourself clinging harder to routines that no longer fit, defending opinions you do not fully believe anymore, reaching for old comforts with unusual intensity, as if trying to prove the previous chapter is still valid. This is not failure. It is the natural friction of an identity that senses its own expiration date and instinctively pushes back against it. People around you may notice you acting slightly out of character during this stretch, more defensive in some conversations, more withdrawn in others. Both responses come from the same place, an old self trying to hold its ground a little longer. Here's the part that reframes this entire stage. The discomfort you feel is not a sign that something is going wrong with you. It is the exact friction that occurs whenever an identity nears its own threshold. 717 tends to intensify in frequency precisely during this friction. Not to comfort the old self and not to rush it either. It marks the space where the old self is still technically present, even while a different version of you is already quietly forming underneath. This is why the timing of these sightings can feel almost uncomfortable. You see the number while still defending a version of your life you privately know you are outgrowing. That contradiction is not confusion. It is exactly what this threshold looks like from the inside. Think about what you have been holding on to more tightly than usual lately. A relationship dynamic, a career narrative, a belief about who you are allowed to become. Whatever it is, notice the intensity with which you have been defending it. That intensity is information. It tells you precisely where the old self is fighting hardest to survive its own ending. The old self is not your enemy in this process. It built the life you are now quietly outgrowing, and it deserves to end with some dignity rather than be rushed out the door. But it cannot decide when the chapter closes. That decision was already made the moment 717 started appearing at this frequency, marking a threshold your body crossed before your identity agreed to follow. What comes next is something many people mistake for loss, when it is actually the opposite. We need to look closely at why letting go of an old identity so often feels like grief, even when what is forming underneath it is something you actually wanted. What you mistook for loss. Somewhere in this process you likely felt something that resembled grief. Not because anyone died and not because anything was technically taken from you. You grieved a version of your own future you had quietly been planning around. The life you assumed would keep unfolding the way it always had. This kind of grief is rarely discussed, because it does not fit the categories people expect loss to come in. There is no funeral for an outdated identity. No one sends flowers when a future you imagined quietly stops being available. So you carried it alone, confused by your own sadness, wondering why something that should feel like progress kept feeling like mourning instead. Here is the part that changes how this stage should be understood. You are not grieving something taken from you. You are grieving something you are actively releasing, on some level you already agreed to. That distinction matters enormously. Grief for a loss you did not choose feels like injustice. Grief for a future you are releasing on purpose feels like growth, wearing sadness as its disguise. 717 tends to appear most densely during this exact emotional stretch. The days where you feel the quiet ache of a future ending without being able to point to a single visible cause. It is not appearing to deepen the sadness. It is marking the precise moment your internal story shifts from defending the old plan to slowly building tolerance for the new one. Notice if you have recently mourned something you cannot fully explain to other people. A version of a relationship that was never going to happen the way you imagined. A career path you quietly stopped pursuing in your mind before stopping it out loud. That private mourning is not weakness, and it is not regression. It is the necessary cost of authentic change, the part nobody warns you about when they describe transformation as purely exciting. Most transformation content skips this stage entirely, because grief does not photograph well next to the language of growth. But growth without grief is rare, almost suspicious because it usually means nothing important was actually released. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The fact that you are mourning at all means the previous chapter mattered to you. People do not grieve things they never valued. This sadness, uncomfortable as it is, confirms that what is ending was real, and that what is forming next deserves the same seriousness you gave to what came before it. The next layer asks a harder question. What happens to the people who were part of the old chapter, the ones who may not be coming with you into the next one? The bridge between two people you have been. Every dividing line creates two versions of you standing on opposite sides of it. The person you were before, and the person slowly emerging after. These two versions are not strangers to each other, but they are not identical either. The bridge between them is where most of this transition's discomfort actually lives. You may have noticed conversations that used to feel natural suddenly feeling slightly forced, friendships that once required no effort starting to feel like work you are not sure you still want to do. This is the bridge revealing itself. Some relationships were built around the person you were becoming the marker for, not around the person quietly forming underneath that role. Here is the detail that reframes this stage entirely. The discomfort in these relationships is not betrayal, and it is not their fault or yours. It is simply two timelines briefly overlapping while one of you keeps changing shape. People who knew the earlier version of you sometimes hold on to that version a little too tightly, because it is the one they understood and trusted. When you start shifting, it can feel to them like loss, even when nothing was actually taken. 717 often surfaces heavily on the bridge itself. This is the awkward middle space where you no longer fully fit your old circle. You have not yet found your footing in whatever comes next. This is exactly why the timing feels so uncomfortable. You see the number in rooms full of people who still expect the earlier version of you to show up. A different version is quietly trying to exist in the same conversation. That tension is not a sign you are doing this wrong. It is the natural cost of crossing a threshold, while people around you remain anchored to the side you are leaving. Some relationships will cross the bridge with you, adjusting gradually as you change. Others will stay rooted exactly where they were, expecting the original version of you to eventually return. Neither outcome makes the relationship meaningless. It simply reveals which connections were built around your evolving identity and which were built around a fixed version that has already started to dissolve. The hardest part of this stage is not the distance forming with certain people. It is the guilt of changing in ways that quietly reshape relationships you never intended to disrupt. That guilt deserves more attention than most transformation advice gives it, because pretending the bridge is painless does not make the crossing any easier. We need to look directly at why this timing never feels convenient, no matter how prepared you think you are. Why the timing never feels convenient. If you have wondered why this shift seems to be happening at the worst possible moment, you are not imagining it. Almost nobody experiences this threshold on a day that feels emotionally available for it. There is rarely a calm, spacious window where transformation politely waits for you to be ready. It tends to arrive in the middle of obligations, deadlines, and responsibilities that do not pause for your internal process. This is one of the most frustrating parts of crossing a real threshold. You are asked to become someone new while still performing the daily logistics of the person you used to be. Here is the reframe that actually helps here. The timing is not cruel, and it is not poorly chosen. Identity shifts rarely wait for convenience, because convenience would let the old self negotiate its way out of changing at all. If transformation only happened when life was calm and uncomplicated, most people would simply postpone it indefinitely. They would wait for a perfect window that conveniently never arrives. 717 tends to appear most insistently during exactly these inconvenient stretches, in the middle of a hard week, during an ordinary commute while you are technically focused on something else entirely. This is not the number adding pressure to an already full life. It is marking that the threshold is happening regardless of your calendar, and quietly asking you to notice it instead of postponing the noticing. Think about the timing of your own recent sightings. Were they during a peaceful afternoon with nothing demanding your attention, or were they tucked into busy, ordinary moments you almost missed entirely? Most people report the second pattern, because thresholds do not wait for spaciousness. They happen inside real life, while you are still managing emails, dinners, and everything else nobody pauses for you. This matters because it changes what you are allowed to expect from yourself right now. You do not need a clear, uninterrupted runway to cross this threshold properly. You only need to notice it is already happening, even while everything else continues around you. The version of you forming on the other side of this line is not waiting for an easier season to arrive. It is forming now, in these exact inconvenient weeks, whether or not you feel ready for it. What comes next is one of the more uncomfortable truths about this process. Becoming someone new almost always involves a private kind of grief. It has nothing to do with anyone else's approval or understanding. The grief of becoming someone new. There is a specific kind of sadness that shows up when you are becoming someone you actually wanted to become. It feels contradictory at first, almost embarrassing to admit out loud. Why would progress feel heavy? Why would a version of yourself you have been working toward arrive wrapped in something close to mourning instead of relief? The answer is simpler than it seems. Becoming someone new always requires the death of someone familiar, even when that familiar version was no longer serving you well. You are allowed to miss the comfort of the old identity, even while actively choosing to leave it behind. Comfort and rightness are not the same thing, and missing one does not mean you doubt the other. Here is something almost nobody says clearly enough. This grief is proof that the transformation is real, not evidence that you are making a mistake. People rarely mourn changes that meant nothing to them. 717 tends to appear with unusual frequency during this exact emotional terrain. The quiet ache that follows real growth. The part transformation stories tend to leave out entirely. It is not appearing to deepen your sadness, and it is not appearing to rush you out of it either. It marks the legitimacy of what you are experiencing, confirming that something genuinely ended, even if nobody else around you noticed it happen. This stage asks you to hold two true things simultaneously. You can be relieved to be leaving an old chapter, and still privately grieve specific pieces of it, without either feeling canceling the other out. Most people are not given permission to feel both at once. They are told to celebrate growth and quietly told to stop mourning what it cost, as if grief disqualifies the progress somehow. It does not. The two coexist constantly during real transformation, and pretending otherwise only makes people doubt a process that is actually working exactly as it should. If you have felt strangely emotional during what should objectively be good news, this is likely why. You are not malfunctioning. You are fully present for the cost of becoming someone you actually chose. There is a specific moment many people remember from this stage, often small and easy to miss at the time. A song that suddenly feels unbearable. A street you avoid without quite knowing why. A habit you keep almost performing out of muscle memory, before catching yourself mid-motion. These small triggers are not setbacks. They are simply proof that the old identity left real traces behind, the way any meaningful chapter does when it finally closes. You do not need to resolve every one of these triggers before moving forward. Some of them will simply fade on their own, quietly, the longer you live inside the new chapter instead of constantly looking back toward the one you left. What helps most here is permission. Permission to feel relieved and sad in the same hour. Permission to miss something you do not actually want returned to you. Permission to let this stage take as long as it actually needs, instead of rushing toward a version of closure that looks tidy from the outside. The next layer takes this further, into the specific things 717 seems designed to protect you from confronting too soon, before you are emotionally ready to face them clearly. What 717 protects you from seeing too soon. There is a reason this number tends to arrive gradually, in small, repeated doses, instead of all at once with full clarity from the very beginning. If you understood the entire shift immediately, it would likely overwhelm you before you had the capacity to hold it. 717 seems to function less like an announcement and more like a sequence, releasing meaning in pieces your nervous system can actually absorb without shutting down. Early sightings tend to feel mysterious, almost decorative, easy to dismiss as coincidence. That is intentional, in a sense. You are not yet ready for the full weight of what is shifting. Later sightings start to feel heavier, harder to ignore, arriving at moments that feel too specific to explain away. By then, you have already absorbed enough of the earlier stages to handle the deeper layer without breaking under it. Here is the part that reframes the entire pacing of this experience. The number is not hiding information from you out of cruelty. It is protecting your capacity to integrate change at a speed your identity can actually survive. If the full truth of a transition arrived instantly, fully formed, most people would either panic or freeze, paralyzed by the size of what is being asked of them. Instead, 717 lets the threshold unfold gradually, giving your sense of self time to stretch before it has to hold the entire new shape all at once. This explains why some people report feeling almost relieved once they finally understand what the number has been pointing toward. The relief comes from realizing they were never behind. They were exactly on schedule for a process designed to be slow on purpose. Notice how your own relationship to this number has shifted over time. Early encounters likely felt curious or strange. Later ones probably felt more direct, more emotionally loaded, harder to brush aside as nothing. That progression follows your own readiness. It increases in clarity exactly as your capacity to handle that clarity increased alongside it. You are not late to this realization. You arrived at it the moment you were actually able to hold it without collapsing under its weight. Think about how differently this would have landed earlier in your life, during a year when you genuinely did not have the emotional capacity for it. The same threshold arriving at the wrong time can break someone instead of building them. This is part of why the number sometimes appears for months before its meaning becomes clear. It is not stalling. It is waiting for the version of you capable of holding the realization without being undone by it. That waiting period is not wasted time, even though it can feel frustrating in the moment, especially if you sense something significant is approaching without being able to name it yet. The next part of this story is harder to hear. It involves the people who do not make it across the bridge with you, the relationships that quietly end as a direct cost of this threshold, the people who get left on the other side. Not everyone crosses a threshold like this with you, and that is one of the harder truths nobody prepares you for in advance. Some relationships were built specifically for the version of you that existed before this line. When you change shape, certain connections simply stop fitting. Not because anyone did anything wrong. The original agreement between you was unspoken and specific to who you used to be. This can feel like a quiet betrayal, even though nobody actually betrayed anyone. You changed. They stayed consistent. The gap between those two facts becomes its own kind of ending. Here's the part that helps most people sit with this more peacefully. Not every relationship is meant to survive every chapter of your life. That does not make the earlier chapter, or the people in it, any less real or valuable. 717 tends to intensify right around the moments these specific endings become undeniable. The conversation that finally confirms distance. The friendship that quietly stops requiring effort from either side. It is not appearing to cause these endings. It is marking the threshold where you stop performing closeness that already stopped being mutual, even if neither of you said so directly. Think about which relationships have felt different lately, slightly more effortful, slightly less natural than they used to. Notice whether that shift started around the same window your sightings began increasing. This is rarely coincidence. It usually means that relationship was tied to the identity you are quietly leaving, rather than to the one currently forming underneath it. You are allowed to grieve these endings without needing to assign blame to either side. Some bridges simply were not built to extend all the way across this particular threshold. What matters now is recognizing which connections are adjusting alongside you, and giving those relationships the attention the ones left behind no longer require. There is also a quieter version of this ending, one that happens without any conversation at all. No argument, no clear moment where things changed, just a slow fading, until one day you notice you have not spoken in months, and neither of you seems particularly bothered by it. This kind of ending is harder to grieve, precisely because it offers no closure to point to. You are left holding an absence with no clear story attached to it, which makes it tempting to dismiss the loss entirely. It is enough to let those connections quietly recede, without forcing a conversation neither of you may actually want to have. Closure is not always a conversation. Sometimes it is simply distance, allowed to exist without apology. The next layer shifts the focus forward, toward recognizing the early signs that the second half of this story has already quietly begun, even before you feel fully settled into it. How to recognize the second half beginning. At some point in this process, the second half of your story quietly starts, often before you consciously notice the first half has ended. There is no announcement for this, no clear marker that says the new chapter has officially opened. Instead, there are small signals, easy to overlook if you are still focused on grieving what came before. A decision that feels surprisingly easy, in an area that used to feel impossibly complicated. A conversation where you say something honest without rehearsing it first. A boundary you set without the usual guilt trailing behind it. These small shifts are the second half announcing itself quietly. Here is what most people miss during this stage. They keep watching for a dramatic beginning, something cinematic enough to confirm the new chapter has started. But real beginnings rarely arrive that way. They arrive in ordinary moments, almost too small to notice, until you look back later and realize that particular Tuesday was when something fundamentally shifted, even though nothing visibly happened that day. 717 often appears densely right around these early signals, less as a celebration and more as a quiet confirmation that the new pattern has actually started taking hold. This is the number functioning differently than it did earlier in the process. It is no longer marking an ending in progress. It is beginning to mark a foundation that is slowly becoming solid underneath you. If you have noticed small moments of unexpected clarity lately, decisions made without the usual second guessing, this is likely why. The second half of your story is not announcing itself loudly. It is simply becoming more frequent than the first half used to be. Pay attention to these small signals over the coming weeks. They tend to accumulate quietly, until one day you realize you have been living inside the new chapter for longer than you initially noticed. This recognition tends to bring a specific kind of relief, the sense that you survived a threshold that once felt impossible to imagine surviving. There is no need to mark this beginning with anything dramatic. No ceremony required, no announcement owed to anyone watching from the outside. The second half rarely asks for celebration this early. It simply asks for your attention. The willingness to notice it forming instead of dismissing it as nothing because it did not arrive the way you expected. Some people resist this stage without realizing it, almost waiting for permission to fully step into the new chapter. You do not need permission. The threshold already gave you that, the moment it placed you on this side of the line. The next layer looks at why this exact pattern, ending, grief, threshold, beginning, tends to repeat itself across a life, and why recognizing it earlier each time changes everything about how it feels. The pattern that repeats until you listen. This is not the first threshold you have crossed in your life, even if it feels like the most significant one right now. Most people move through several of these dividing lines across a lifetime, each one slightly different in shape but strangely similar underneath. There is usually a quiet period beforehand, where something feels subtly off without a clear explanation. Then a stretch of resistance where the old identity tries to hold its ground a little longer than it should. Then grief, often misunderstood as something going wrong instead of something ending correctly. Then a slow, undramatic beginning that only becomes visible in hindsight. Here is the part that changes how you relate to this pattern going forward. The pattern itself is not the problem. Missing it each time until it is nearly finished is what makes every threshold feel unnecessarily disorienting. 717 appears specifically to interrupt that pattern of missing it. It gives you an early marker, a way to recognize the threshold while you are still inside it, instead of only understanding it months later in hindsight. This time, you are not finding out after the fact. You are recognizing the shape of the threshold while you are still living through it, which changes your entire relationship to the discomfort it brings. Think back to an earlier threshold in your life, one you only understood clearly long after it had already passed. Notice how much smoother that period might have felt if you had recognized its shape while you were still inside it. That is precisely the advantage this current threshold is offering you. Not a way to avoid the discomfort entirely, but a way to move through it with your eyes open instead of disoriented and unprepared. Every future threshold you cross will likely follow a similar emotional architecture: recognition, resistance, grief, and a quiet new beginning forming underneath all of it. The more familiar you become with this shape, the less each new threshold will feel like an emergency. It will start to feel like a pattern you already know how to move through with steadiness. This does not mean future thresholds stop hurting. Grief does not disappear just because you recognize its shape faster. But recognition changes the experience in one important way. You stop fighting the process itself, and you start simply moving through it. That shift alone removes a significant amount of unnecessary suffering. Most of the pain people associate with these dividing lines comes not from the change itself, but from resisting the fact that change is already underway. You are learning something here that will outlast this particular threshold. You are learning what your own pattern actually looks like, which means the next one will announce itself to you far sooner than this one did. What remains now is understanding where you actually stand today, on this exact side of the line you have been crossing throughout everything we have just covered together. Where you stand now, that the line is behind you. You started this knowing only that something had shifted, without being able to name exactly what or when. That uncertainty is largely gone now. You can see the shape of the threshold clearly, recognition, resistance, grief, and a quiet beginning forming underneath all of it. 717 was never appearing to frighten you, and it was never appearing simply to comfort you either. It was marking a precise structural point, the place where one version of your life ends and another quietly starts forming underneath it, long before you have full proof that it is happening. You crossed that line already. Not today, and probably not on any single dramatic day you can point to with certainty. You crossed it gradually through the small inconvenient moments, the grief you could not fully explain, the relationships that quietly shifted shape around you. What remains now is simpler than it felt at the beginning of this. You do not need to force the new chapter into existence through effort alone. It is already forming quietly, in the small decisions you have started making, with less hesitation than before. Give yourself permission to stop searching for a dramatic confirmation that the shift is real. The confirmation has already been happening, in the ordinary moments you almost missed because you were waiting for something louder. The version of you on this side of the line is not finished forming, and it does not need to be finished today. It simply needs to keep moving forward, gently, without forcing the next chapter to prove itself all at once. You will likely keep seeing 717 for a while longer. Not as a warning now, more as a quiet marker that you are exactly where you are supposed to be in this unfolding. That marker may soften over time. Sightings often slow down once the threshold has been fully crossed. The new chapter no longer needs confirming once it has simply become your life again, ordinary and unremarkable in the best possible way. If the number fades for a while, that is not a sign you did something wrong. It usually means the structural work it was pointing toward has finished, at least for this particular threshold, and your attention is no longer needed there. There may be a future moment when 717 returns, marking another line you have not yet seen coming. That is fine. You will recognize it faster this time because you now know what the shape of a real threshold actually feels like from the inside. You will know the early restlessness for what it is. You will recognize the grief without mistaking it for failure. You will notice when an old identity is defending itself a little too loudly, and you will let it close anyway, with less resistance than this time required. For now, let this chapter settle. You do not need to announce the change to everyone who knew the earlier version of you. You do not need proof beyond what you have already lived through these last several weeks. The line is behind you. What stands ahead of it is still forming quietly, in the ordinary decisions you are already making with steadier hands than you had before any of this began.